The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Mrs. Rose Thompson stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace with slightly trembling fingers. At 80 years old, her reflection showed a face full of wisdom, with gentle wrinkles that told stories of thousands of students she taught over her 60-year career as a math teacher. Today wasn't just any ordinary day. It was her birthday, and she had made a decision that had been 60 years in the making. Her modest two-story house, purchased back in 1970, held memories in every corner. Photos of her late husband, children, and grandchildren covered the walls, alongside academic awards and thank-you letters from former students. The scent of her morning coffee still lingered in the air as she picked up her designer handbag, a Christmas present from her grandchildren who had pooled their money together to buy it for their beloved grandmother. Rose had always been smart with money, something she taught both her students and her family. While her teacher's salary wasn't enormous, she had mastered the art of investing. Every month, without fail, she put aside a portion of her earnings, investing in stocks and real estate when others thought she was crazy to do so. "A penny saved today is a dollar earned tomorrow," she would tell her students, teaching them about compound interest using real-world examples. Her friends often questioned why she still lived in her modest house when she could afford something more luxurious. "This house has my heart," she would say with a warm smile, patting the worn but well-maintained walls. But there was one dream she had held onto since she was a young teacher, watching the luxury cars drive past her classroom window, owning a brand-new Mercedes-Benz. For months, she had done her research, spending evenings on her iPad, another gift from her loving family, studying different models, features, and prices. She knew exactly what she wanted. A brand new S-Class in elegant black, with all the safety features that would make her children feel more comfortable about their mother driving at her age. As she finished getting ready, Rose looked at the printed specifications in her folder one last time. Her handwritten notes covered the margins, questions about features, calculations of payments, though she planned to pay in full, and comparisons with other models. A lifetime of teaching mathematics had made her meticulous in her preparation. She checked her appearance one final time, her best dress, pressed and proper, her comfortable but stylish shoes, and her signature pearl necklace that her husband had given her on their 40th anniversary. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and despite her age, she stood tall, with the dignity of someone who had spent her life shaping young minds. Picking up her well-worn cane, a necessary companion since her hip surgery last year, Rose called for a taxi. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden as the taxi pulled up. "Going somewhere special?" she called out. Rose just smiled mysteriously and waved back. She had decided not to tell anyone about her plans until she had the keys in her hand. After all, at her age, people tended to be overprotective, always telling her what she should or shouldn't do. As the taxi drove through the city streets, Rose watched the familiar buildings pass by. She had taught generations of the city's children, and many of her former students now owned businesses, worked in hospitals, or had become teachers themselves. Her heart swelled with pride thinking of all the lives she had touched. Today, though, was about fulfilling her own dream, one that she had put on hold while raising her family and helping put her children through college. The taxi turned onto Luxury Lane, where high-end car dealerships lined both sides of the street. Rose's heart beat faster as they approached Silver Star Luxury Motors, its glass and chrome building gleaming in the morning sun. Little did she know that this visit would become more than just a car purchase. It would become a moment that would spark a movement for change. The taxi pulled up to Silver Star Luxury Motors just as the clock struck 10. Mrs. Rose Thompson watched through the window as two young couples walked out of the dealership, their faces bright with excitement, clearly having just purchased their dream cars. She smiled, thinking soon she'd have that same joy written across her face. "Are you sure this is where you want to be dropped off, ma'am?" the taxi driver asked, glancing uncertainly at the luxury dealership. Rose nodded, her eyes twinkling with determination. She paid the fare, adding a generous tip, something she always did, remembering her own days of working extra jobs to make ends meet while starting her teaching career. Using her cane for support, Rose stepped out of the taxi, taking a moment to steady herself on the perfectly manicured sidewalk. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the dealership's immaculate lawn. Through the towering glass windows, she could see rows of gleaming vehicles, their pristine surfaces reflecting the showroom lights like stars. As she approached the entrance, a young couple rushed past her, nearly causing her to lose her balance. The gentleman held the door open for his partner, but let it swing shut before Rose could reach it. Taking a deep breath, she grasped the heavy door handle with her free hand and made her way inside. The showroom was even more impressive up close. The floor was polished to mirror-like perfection, and soft classical music played through hidden speakers. The air conditioning hit her face with a blast of cool air, making her glad she'd worn her wool cardigan despite the warm weather outside. 3 salespeople stood near the reception desk, all wearing matching navy blue suits with silver name tags that caught the light as they moved. Rose noticed how they huddled together, speaking in low voices and occasionally glancing in her direction. None made a move to greet her. She stood near the entrance for what felt like an eternity, her cane making small taps against the floor as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. A young family walked in behind her, and immediately one of the salespeople broke away from the group, heading straight for them with a bright smile. Drawing herself up to her full height, though age had taken an inch or two over the years, Rose decided to approach the desk herself. Her heels clicked against the floor, echoing in the vast space. She'd worn these shoes to her grandson's college graduation last year, and they still gave her the confidence boost she needed. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the warmth and authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding classroom attention. "I'm here to look at the new S-Class." The youngest salesman, whose name tag read Peter, looked up from his phone with barely concealed surprise. He glanced at his colleagues, who had stopped their conversation to watch the interaction. The silence that followed was deafening. Rose could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of their stares. She'd faced similar looks before. Back in 1964, when she became the first black teacher at her school, during parents' meetings where some questioned her qualifications despite her master's degree, and even recently at high-end stores where security guards followed her a little too closely. "The S-Class," Peter repeated, dragging out each syllable as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. "Ma'am, are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable at Heritage Motors down the street? They have some nice used cars that might be more suitable." Rose felt her face grow warm, but years of handling difficult situations in the classroom had taught her to maintain her composure. She opened her designer handbag, reaching for the folder containing her carefully prepared research. Just then, 2 more customers walked in, both younger men in business suits. Immediately, the other salespeople rushed to greet them, their voices carrying across the showroom as they offered coffee and discussed the latest models. Standing there, with her folder half opened and her dignity on the line, Rose realized this visit was about to become much more than just buying a car. It was about to become a lesson in respect, prejudice, and the mistake of judging a book by its cover. Exactly the kind of teachable moment she'd spent her entire career looking for. Mrs. Rose Thompson stood her ground, her fingers gripping both her cane and her research folder. After 60 years of teaching, she could spot condescension from a mile away. Peter, the young salesman, was now leaning against the counter, exchanging knowing looks with his colleagues while the other customers were being treated like royalty just a few feet away. "Young man," Rose said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when students thought they could outsmart her in class. "I've done my research. I know exactly what I want, and I can assure you I can afford any car in this showroom." She pulled out her meticulously prepared documents, including bank statements that would make their eyes pop. Another salesperson, an older man with graying temples, wandered over. His name tag read Richard, He looked at the papers in Rose's hand and chuckled. "Ma'am, do you realize these cars cost more than a house? Maybe your children or grandchildren sent you here. Should we call someone to pick you up?" Rose felt her heart racing, but decades of facing prejudice had taught her to channel her anger into dignity. She remembered telling her students that education and success weren't just about numbers and grades. They were about proving people wrong with grace and determination. "Actually," she replied, pulling out her iPad from her designer bag, "I'd like to show you the exact model I'm interested in. I've been following the market for months." She opened her saved pages, displaying detailed specifications and pricing comparisons she'd researched. The salespeople exchanged glances again. A small crowd of other customers had gathered nearby, some pretending to look at cars while clearly watching the scene unfold. Rose could hear their whispers, see their stares from the corner of her eye. "Look," Peter said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "we're very busy with serious customers right now. Maybe you're a bit confused about where you are? These aren't regular cars. The base model starts at more than most people make in a year." Rose straightened her back, feeling the weight of her pearl necklace against her collar. Each pearl had been added by her late husband every 5 years of their marriage, representing their journey together. She'd worn it to every major milestone in her life, and today would be no different. "I taught mathematics for 60 years, she said, her voice steady and clear. "I understand numbers quite well. I also understand compound interest, investment strategies, and the value of patience. What I'm struggling to understand is why you assume I can't afford to be here." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a kind tone. "Security," he called out. "I think we have a situation here." A guard from the front desk started walking over, his face already set in a stern expression. Rose felt her hands trembling, but not from fear. She was trembling with the kind of righteous indignation that had fueled progress for generations. She thought about all her former students who had faced similar prejudices, all the times she told them to hold their heads high and let their success speak for itself. She pulled out her phone, another gift from her children who insisted she stay connected. With deliberate calmness, she began recording the scene, something her grandchildren had taught her to do in situations exactly like this. "I'd like to speak to your manager," she said firmly, making sure her voice was clear on the recording. The security guard reached them just as a young couple nearby started whispering loudly about how poorly Rose was being treated. The wife was already pulling out her own phone, clearly disturbed by what she was witnessing. "Ma'am," the security guard started, but Rose held up her hand. The same gesture she used countless times to quiet a rowdy classroom. "Before you say another word," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent showroom, "I want you all to know that everything that's happened in the last 15 minutes has been recorded. Not just by me, but by several of your security cameras." She pointed to the corners of the ceiling where black domes watched silently. "Now, I came here today to buy a car, but it seems I'll be leaving with a much more important purpose." The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted. Other customers were now openly staring, some shaking their heads in disapproval at the staff's behavior. Rose could see smartphones being raised, recording the scene. She thought about how many times she told her students that sometimes the most powerful lessons happen outside the classroom. The showroom had become so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Mrs. Rose Thompson's phone continued recording as she looked each staff member in the eye, the way she used to survey her classroom when teaching an important lesson. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that this situation wasn't what he'd been led to believe. "I've spent my entire life teaching young people that education and hard work can open any door," Rose said, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. "I've taught the children of doctors, janitors, factory workers, and yes, even luxury car salespeople." She paused, letting her words sink in. Some of those students are now running companies, serving in Congress, and changing the world. Just then, another customer walked in, a well-dressed businessman who stopped short at the scene before him. Rose recognized him immediately as one of her former students from 30 years ago, now a successful bank executive. His face lit up with recognition. "Mrs. T," he called out, walking briskly toward her. "Is that really you?" The salespeople watched in confusion as this clearly wealthy man approached Rose with genuine respect and affection. "Well, if it isn't little Bobby Chen," Rose smiled warmly. "Though I suppose it's Mr. Chen now, isn't it? Still remembering to double-check your decimal points." She'd helped him overcome his fear of mathematics in 7th grade, turning him from a struggling student into someone who now managed millions of dollars. Bobby Chen looked around at the scene, his expression changing as he pieced together what was happening. "Mrs. T, are these people giving you trouble?" His voice had an edge to it that made Peter and Richard exchange nervous glances. "Nothing I haven't handled before," Rose replied, standing even straighter. "Though I must say, in all my years of teaching, I never failed a student as quickly as these gentlemen have failed their test of basic human decency." Other customers had gathered closer now, forming a loose circle around the scene. A young woman stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. "I recorded everything," she said. "The way they treated you was absolutely disgraceful." The security guard had backed away slightly, now speaking quietly into his radio. Rose could hear him requesting a manager's presence immediately. She thought about all the times she taught her students about standing up for what's right, about using their voices to speak truth to power. "You know," Rose continued, her voice taking on the tone she'd used for thousands of teachable moments, "I came here today to spend money I earned through decades of hard work. Money I saved while helping countless students achieve their dreams. Money I invested wisely while grading papers late into the night." She opened her designer handbag again, this time pulling out a small, worn photograph. It showed her standing in front of her first classroom in 1964. "I kept this photo all these years to remind myself and my students that appearance, age, and assumptions should never define someone's worth or capabilities." Bobby Chen had moved to stand beside her, his presence adding weight to her words. The young couple who had been recording earlier were now openly sharing their videos on social media. Rose could hear them talking about how the incident was already gaining attention online. The click of dress shoes on the polished floor announced the arrival of someone new, presumably the manager, hurrying from his office. His face showed the concern of someone who knew this situation had already spiraled far beyond a simple customer service issue. "I may have come here to buy a car," Rose said, her voice carrying the weight of 60 years of teaching experience. "But it seems fate had a different lesson planned for today." She turned to face the approaching manager, her pearl necklace catching the light. "Now, young man, shall we discuss how this teachable moment is going to end?" The manager's face had gone pale as he looked from Rose to the crowd of recording customers, to Bobby Chen in his expensive suit, and back to the security cameras, silently witnessing everything. He'd clearly read the room and understood that this situation was much bigger than a potential car sale. It was about dignity, respect, and the consequences of prejudice in modern society. The dealership manager, whose name tag read Thomas, straightened his tie nervously as he approached the group. His eyes darted between the recording phones, the gathering crowd, and Mrs. Rose Thompson's unwavering gaze. She remained perfectly poised, one hand on her cane, the other still holding her phone steady. "I'm the general manager," Thomas began, trying to sound authoritative despite his obvious discomfort. "There seems to be some misunderstanding here." He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Bobby Chen, Rose's former student, stepped forward. "The only misunderstanding," he said firmly, "is your staff thinking they could judge someone's worth by their appearance. Do you know who this woman is? She's shaped the minds of thousands of students over 60 years. Some of us now run banks, businesses, and—" He pulled out his business card. "Manage portfolios worth millions." Rose raised her hand slightly, that same gentle gesture that had quieted countless classrooms. "Bobby, dear, let me handle this. I'm still teaching, you see." She turned to Thomas. "Young man, would you like to see my financial documents now, or shall we discuss how quickly this video is spreading online?" The manager's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his face growing paler as he read the screen. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone completely changed, "I sincerely apologize for this situation. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office." "No," Rose replied calmly. "I think right here is perfect. You see, every student in my classroom learned that actions have consequences, and lessons are best learned in public when the mistakes were made in public." The young couple who had been recording looked up from their phones. "It's already got thousands of views," the wife announced. "People are asking for the dealership's name and location." Thomas wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Thompson, please. We value all our customers. Let me show you our finest models personally. We can offer you an excellent deal." "A deal?" Rose interrupted, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when catching students trying to charm their way out of homework. "I came here prepared to pay full price for a car I've spent years dreaming about. Now I'm wondering if my money wouldn't be better spent establishing a foundation to teach businesses about respect and dignity." Bobby Chin's eyes lit up. "Mrs. T, that's brilliant. I'd be happy to help set that up. My bank could even provide matching funds." He was already pulling out his phone, making notes. The crowd had grown larger, with more customers entering the showroom and immediately being drawn into the scene. Someone mentioned that a local news van had just pulled up outside. Rose noticed Peter and Richard, the salespeople who had dismissed her, trying to quietly slip away. "Stay right there," she called to them, her teacher's voice making them freeze mid-step. "This lesson isn't over yet." She turned back to Thomas. "Your salespeople thought I was confused about being here. Let me clear up that confusion. I've taught mathematics for 60 years. I can calculate compound interest in my head. I've invested wisely, saved carefully, and lived modestly because I chose to pour my energy into teaching rather than showing off wealth." She opened her folder, finally displaying her bank statements and investment portfolio. Thomas's eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. "As you can see," Rose continued, "I could buy half the cars in this showroom without blinking. But now I have a different question for you. How much is dignity worth?" The glass doors opened again, and a news reporter walked in, cameraman in tow. They'd apparently heard of the viral video and came to investigate. Rose stood a little straighter, her pearl necklace gleaming under the showroom lights. "Now then," she said, looking directly at Thomas while the cameras started rolling, "shall we discuss how this dealership plans to ensure no other customer experiences what I did today? Because while I may have come here to buy a car, it seems I've been called to teach one final lesson about respect, assumption, and the true value of a person." The news reporter was already setting up for an interview, while Bobby Chen was making calls on his phone. The young couple who'd recorded everything were showing their videos to other customers, and through the windows, Rose could see more media vehicles pulling up. The showroom had transformed into an impromptu news conference. The local news reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, positioned her microphone carefully as she spoke with Mrs. Rose Thompson. The morning sun streamed through the dealership's windows, making Rose's pearl necklace shimmer as she shared her story. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Rose explained to the camera, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here because after 60 years of teaching young minds about respect and dignity, some lessons still need to be taught." She glanced at the dealership staff, who now stood in a nervous cluster near the manager's office. Bobby Chen, her former student, was busy making calls on his phone. "Yes, that's right," he was saying, "my old math teacher. The one who helped me understand finance in the first place." He paused, listening. "Yes, we're looking to establish a foundation immediately. Can you have the paperwork ready by this afternoon?" The young couple who had first recorded the incident were now showing their phones to the news crew. "Look at these comments," the wife said, scrolling through her social media feed. People from all over are sharing similar experiences. It's not just about Mrs. Thompson anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been judged unfairly. Thomas, the manager, had finally found his voice again. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, approaching with visible humility, "would you be willing to help us create a new training program for our staff? Your experience as a teacher would be invaluable." Rose adjusted her grip on her cane, thinking about all the teachable moments she'd encountered in her long career. "Young man, that's the first sensible thing I've heard in this showroom today. But it needs to go beyond just training. We need real change." More people had gathered outside the dealership, some holding phones, others just watching through the windows. Rose could see some of her former students among them. A doctor she taught in 1975, a lawyer from her 1989 class, even a city council member who'd struggled with fractions in 1992. "You know," Rose continued, addressing both the cameras and the growing crowd, "every student who walked into my classroom learned one important thing first. Numbers don't lie, but people's assumptions often do. I taught them that mathematics is about more than just calculations. It's about understanding value." The news reporter leaned in, genuinely intrigued. "And what value do you see coming from this situation, Mrs. Thompson?" Rose smiled, the same warm smile that had encouraged thousands of students over the years. "I see an opportunity. When I walked in here today, I thought I was just buying a car. But sometimes life gives you a pop quiz, and how you handle it determines the real lesson." Bobby Chen approached with his phone still in hand. "Mrs. T, I've got 3 bank presidents and a corporate CEO on board already. They want to support the foundation. They're all former students who remember your lessons about respect and dignity." The dealership's owner had arrived by now, having rushed over after seeing the viral videos. He looked both concerned and contemplative as he watched the scene unfold in his showroom. Rose noticed him speaking quietly with Thomas, both men occasionally glancing her way with growing respect. "My students always asked why they needed to learn math," Rose said to the cameras, her voice carrying the wisdom of 60 years in the classroom. "I told them it wasn't just about numbers, it was about understanding worth. Whether it's calculating compound interest or measuring the value of treating people with dignity, the principles remain the same." The young couple who had recorded everything were now sharing stories with other customers about times they'd witnessed discrimination. The showroom had become a place of open dialogue, with people from all walks of life sharing experiences and ideas for change. "You see," Rose continued, her teacher's voice drawing everyone's attention, "I could walk out of here today, go to another dealership, and buy any car I want. But what would that teach? Sometimes the most important lessons come from standing your ground and turning a moment of disrespect into an opportunity for growth." The owner stepped forward, finally ready to address the situation. In his hands, he held what looked like security camera footage from the morning's events. The entire incident had been captured from multiple angles, providing undeniable evidence of what had transpired. Rose watched him approach, knowing that this moment would lead to something much bigger than a car purchase. The dealership owner, an older gentleman with silver hair, approached Mrs. Rose Thompson with the security footage in his hands. His face showed the kind of concern that comes from realizing a serious mistake had been made under your watch. The cameras continued rolling as he stopped in front of Rose, who stood tall despite her cane, her decades of teaching experience evident in her dignified posture. "Mrs. Thompson," the owner began, his voice carrying across the now hushed showroom, "I've watched this footage 3 times now. I built this dealership 30 years ago with a promise to treat every customer like family. Today, we failed that promise spectacularly." Rose watched him carefully, the same way she used to observe students when they were finally understanding a difficult concept. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the polished floor, and more people were gathering outside, some holding handmade signs supporting her. You know, Rose said thoughtfully, in my classroom, when students made mistakes, I never focused on punishment. I focused on learning. What will you learn from this? Her question hung in the air, carrying the weight of 60 years of teaching experience. The owner looked around at his staff, at the cameras, at the growing crowd outside. I'd like to propose something, he said, pulling out a business card and handing it to Bobby Chen, who was still coordinating with other supporters on his phone. Our dealership will be the first corporate sponsor of your foundation. We'll commit to a full training program, not just for our staff, but open to other businesses as well. A murmur went through the crowd. The news reporter stepped closer with her microphone, sensing a significant development. Rose adjusted her pearl necklace, a habit she developed over decades of thoughtful moments in the classroom. Furthermore, the owner continued, I want to offer our showroom as a meeting space for the Foundation's educational programs. We can start right here, where the problem began, to create real change. Bobby Chen looked up from his phone, impressed. Mrs. T, we've got 12 more corporate sponsors lined up already. Your former students are rallying together. The story's gone national. He showed her his screen, where news websites were already picking up the story. The young couple who had first recorded the incident stepped forward. We've been getting messages from people all over the country, the wife said, her phone continuously buzzing with notifications. They're sharing similar stories and asking how they can help. Rose looked at Peter and Richard, the salespeople who had dismissed her earlier. They stood at the back of the crowd, their faces showing a mix of shame and understanding. Would you two like to be the first to sign up for our training program? She asked, using the same encouraging tone she'd used with struggling students. They stepped forward, heads bowed slightly. Yes, ma'am, Peter said quietly. We were wrong, and we want to learn. The owner nodded approvingly before turning back to Rose. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. He gestured toward the showroom's central display area, where a brand-new S-Class Mercedes stood gleaming under the lights. This card is yours, at no cost, with my personal apology. Rose held up her hand, that familiar teacher's gesture that could quiet a room. No, she said firmly but kindly. I came here to buy a car with the money I earned through years of hard work. Giving me a free car doesn't solve the real problem. Instead, take that money and put it into the foundation. Let's teach people that respect isn't about grand gestures, it's about everyday dignity. The news reporter was frantically taking notes as Bobby Chen's phone continued to buzz with more supporters joining the cause. Through the windows, Rose could see more news vans pulling up outside. What had started as a simple car purchase had transformed into something much more significant. Besides, Rose added with a small smile, what kind of teacher would I be if I didn't make sure everyone learned the proper value of things? The crowd chuckled, and even the owner managed a genuine smile, recognizing the wisdom in her words. The morning had turned into early afternoon, and the showroom had become a hub of activity. People were sharing stories, making plans, and coming together in a way that reminded Rose of her best days in the classroom, when a lesson went far beyond the textbook and touched real lives. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the dealership's windows as Mrs. Rose Thompson sat in a comfortable chair someone had brought from the manager's office. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from former students who'd seen the viral videos. The showroom had transformed into something that reminded her of her old classroom, a place where real learning was happening. Mrs. T, Bobby Chen said, looking up from his laptop where he'd been organizing foundation details, you won't believe this. The state governor just called. She wants to meet with you about implementing sensitivity training across all state-licensed businesses. Rose smoothed her dress, thinking about how differently this day had turned out from what she'd planned. The young couple who'd first recorded the incident were now helping to organize incoming messages from supporters. Their video had reached millions of views in just a few hours. Look at this, the wife said, showing Rose her phone. People are sharing stories from all over the country. An 85-year-old man in Florida who was ignored at a high-end store. A retired teacher in Chicago who had almost the same experience at a different car dealership. Your story is giving people courage to speak up. The dealership owner had been busy too. He'd spent the last hour on the phone with his corporate office, discussing major changes to their hiring and training policies. Now he approached Rose again, this time with a thick folder of documents. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, pulling up a chair beside her, "I've just gotten off the phone with our national headquarters. They want to make our dealership the pilot location for a new customer respect initiative. Would you consider being part of the advisory board?" Rose adjusted her pearl necklace thoughtfully. "You know, in all my years of teaching, I found that the best lessons weren't planned. They happened when we were ready to learn from our mistakes. Are you ready?" The owner nodded solemnly. "More than ready. And we're not alone. 3 other luxury car brands have already reached out, wanting to be part of this change." Through the showroom windows, Rose could see more people gathering. Some held signs reading, "Respect has no age," and "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." Local business owners had started arriving, asking how they could support the foundation and implement better training for their staff. Peter and Richard, the salespeople who had dismissed her earlier, approached with coffee cups in their hands. "Mrs. Thompson," Peter said, his voice humble, "we've been thinking about what happened. Could you tell us more about your experiences as a teacher? We want to understand better." Rose's eyes twinkled. "Pull up some chairs," she said, using her familiar teacher's voice. "Class is in session." As they sat down, other staff members gathered around too, genuinely interested in learning. The news crew was still there, capturing this unexpected turn of events. The reporter sat cross-legged on the floor with her microphone, like a student ready for a lesson. "Mrs. Thompson," she asked, "did you ever imagine buying a car would turn into something this big?" Rose chuckled softly. "My dear, in 60 years of teaching, I learned that the biggest changes often start with the smallest moments. Sometimes it just takes one person to stand up and say, 'This isn't right,' for others to find their voice too." Bobby Chin's phone buzzed again. "Mrs. T, a major business magazine wants to feature you in their next issue. They're calling it 'The Teacher Who Taught Corporate America a Lesson.'" The young couple who had recorded everything were now helping to set up chairs in a circle, creating an impromptu classroom in the middle of the showroom. Business owners, dealership staff, and community members took their seats, ready to learn. "You see," Rose continued, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades, "I may have retired from the classroom, but teaching never really stops. Every moment is a chance to learn, to grow, to become better than we were yesterday." The afternoon light caught her pearl necklace, creating a soft glow as she looked around at her impromptu class. The showroom had become more than just a place to sell cars. It had become a symbol of change, a classroom where lessons about respect and dignity were being learned by people who needed them most. 1 month had passed since that transformative day at Silver Star Luxury Motors. Mrs. Rose Thompson stood in her driveway, admiring her brand-new Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Not the one from the original dealership, but one she'd purchased from a competing dealership where the staff had treated her with genuine respect from the moment she walked in. The morning sun bounced off the car's polished surface as Rose touched its sleek hood, remembering how differently things had turned out from what she'd planned. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from Bobby Chen about the Foundation's latest achievements. "The Dignity First Foundation has already trained staff at 50 businesses," she read aloud, smiling. The foundation, born from that day at the dealership, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Rose had insisted that all training sessions begin with a simple exercise. Having participants solve a basic math problem together, learning that assumptions about ability often hide real talent. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, walked over from her garden, wiping her hands on her apron. "There's my celebrity neighbor," she teased warmly. I just saw you on the morning news again. They're calling you the teacher who changed corporate America. Rose chuckled, remembering how that first viral video had sparked a movement. The young couple who recorded it had become active foundation members, traveling to document similar stories across the country. Their original video had now been viewed over 20 million times. You know what makes me proudest? Rose said, adjusting her pearl necklace, a habit that had become familiar to millions who had watched her interviews. It's not the foundation or the changes in business policies. It's the letters I receive every day from people who found their voice. She walked to her mailbox, pulling out another stack of envelopes. Every day it brought more stories. A retired doctor who'd been ignored at a jewelry store, an elderly engineer dismissed at a technology shop, a retired judge overlooked at a furniture store. But now these stories came with triumphant endings, of people standing up, speaking out, and being heard. The original dealership had indeed transformed. Under new management, it had become a model for corporate responsibility. Peter and Richard, the salespeople who dismissed her, had completed their training and now led seminars themselves, sharing their story as a lesson in humility and growth. Rose's driveway had become something a landmark. People would drive by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elegant teacher, whose quiet dignity had sparked a national conversation. Sometimes they'd stop to take photos, always respectful, often sharing their own stories of triumph over prejudice. "Mrs. Thompson," called a young voice. Rose turned to see one of her former students jogging up the sidewalk. Now a successful business owner himself, he'd been instrumental in implementing the foundation's training programs across the state. The governor's office called. "They want you to speak at the signing of the new Customer Dignity Act next week." Rose smiled, remembering all the times she told her students that mathematics wasn't just about numbers. It was about understanding value. Now, businesses across the country were learning that lesson too, discovering that respect and dignity weren't just moral choices, but smart business practices. Her new car gleamed in the morning light, but it wasn't just a luxury vehicle anymore. It had become a symbol of something much more important, a reminder that one person's stand for dignity could ripple out and touch countless lives. "You know," Rose said, looking at her former student, "I taught mathematics for 60 years, but the most important lesson was never about numbers. It was about standing up for what's right, about treating everyone with respect, about recognizing the value in each person." She ran her hand along the car's smooth surface one more time, thinking about that morning 1 month ago when she'd walked into a dealership hoping to buy a car and instead had started a movement. The pearl necklace her late husband had given her caught the sunlight, reminding her of all the years, all the lessons, all the lives she'd touched. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best lessons happen outside the classroom. And sometimes a simple car purchase can teach the world about dignity, respect, and the power of standing up for what's right."